today. And before I go to my PowerPoint, I would like to hold up for your view a little thing that I have here. And you can see, hopefully, that it is the subject of your question. It's a double-sided color Xerox of the Biombo screen. It'll fold up, and then I can have it standing on my desk as we talk. So I think that's kind of a neat thing. And we are today going into the global contemporary section. And we will take a slice out of it looking at reclining nudes, which is a tradition in art. And there's some very alternate types of reclining nudes in your global contemporary set. I also wanted to take a minute to talk about the importance of the global contemporary. We already talked about last week how important it is to for your colleges to just have you at least cover or introduce yourself to some of the every part of the curriculum, even if you didn't really have time to do it all because of the truncated year. But the global contemporary is near and dear to me. It is the art of our time. We would never want a student to miss this art. In fact, in my art history class, we do it first in the year, and the students get all excited about it, and then we circle back around to it at the end. And I also wanted to mention that in the global contemporary set, you get a lot more diversity in artists. For example, if you go back in time, you probably notice that so many of the artists are men, and that changes when you get up to global contemporary. So it's just a exciting set, and you know, including as we'll see today, artists that have a fresh and new approach, challenge stereotypes, and it's very interesting. Also, I wanted to mention that a lot of the artists in global contemporary are on Instagram, and so you can get their you know, social media feed. And in addition, a lot of these artists are in a program called Art 21, done by PBS. They're very short, about 14 minutes long, and they're excellent. I recommend those to students very much, as well as other YouTubes. Once again, this is John Gunnan talking, and we are going to start by reviewing the question that Allison Napier gave you on Friday. And this question, as you can see, has kind of broken down into parts. This is typical of a FRQ type question for 15 minutes that you would get. And you can see, if you look at the verbs, identify, describe, and explain. So these questions tend to scaffold into more difficult tasks as they move along. And in addition, that part down at the bottom, once you get used to that, you'll know that they're basically explaining what an identification is. And you know that you need to bring two things to the table when identifying. Okay, so this work is the Biombo screen, the Siege of Belgrad. It's the subject matter is the war between the Turks or the Ottomans and the Europeans, the Habsburgs specifically, and the technique would be the oil painting on wood with enconchado technique. And then, of course, the really interesting part, the hybrid section, the fact that the painting style may have come from Europe, but the enconchado came from Japan, and all these cultures were meeting and mixing in Mexico at this time. It's the Gonzalez family, a family of artists that produced this. And in addition, the context of you know, being a commission by the Viceroy and setting up in the palace in Mexico, and having the two sides, you know, the war side and and the hunting side. So a little bit reminding me of another piece with two sides, the standard of that you might remember. Okay, so let's move on. Here, by the way, are some detail slides because I was able to see this work last summer in San Diego. And so I wanted to give you a couple of up-close looks. And you'll notice there's a really free and fresh kind of brushwork on there that you really don't see if you're seeing it from a long distance away. Okay. So today we will look at two new artists for you. And if you already did the Global Contemporary unit, it will be a review. We're going to see work by Kiki Smith and Wengechi Mutu. Okay, and we're going to review two works that are fair game for the AP test. And then along the day, you'll be practicing your skills. Okay, so going to start with this work by Kiki Smith. I'm giving it to you without a title right now. Just want you to look at it, and you'll notice that this work is a drawing. It combines both the graphite and ink, and it's a drawing on some kind of fragile paper. It seems to be almost taped together or folded up, and it's kind of a fragile drawing. And when you think about it, there's not a lot of drawings in our image set, because typically drawings would be something that an artist would do just getting ready or planning for a painting. Okay, here's a nice picture of Kiki Smith, probably from maybe 30 years ago or so, or 25, 30 years ago. And once again, you really should see the Art 21 program on Kiki Smith. So there's our identifying information down at the bottom. And so I'm I want you to look at this as much as possible and try to think about what's going on lying with the wolf. Now, wolves are predators, right? They're kind of scary, powerful animals in stories, mythology, fairy tales, and whatnot. So here we have a woman that's communing with a wolf. And I want you to look at her face and think about what's going on and how you would interpret this. I'm going to give you a tool that we like to use in my classroom for viewing contemporary or postmodern works, RIO, and that stands for these things, which are things we see in contemporary work quite a lot, a sense of recycling or remixing older things. The global contemporary work is very rich, and these artists often know a lot of traditions in art, or also things from culture, literature, religion, and they get remixed and brought back in interesting ways. Another thing is irony, and you remember from your English class that irony is, when you expect something and something else happens. If I tell you I'm going to show you a reclining female nude, you're not expecting the wolf. And the third is sort of an open-ended quality that really honors the audience as being, diverse, and people are coming in with a lot of different backgrounds and expectations. And so there's often a chance to interpret contemporary work. Okay. So, this kind of reminds me of when I'm having a bad day and I pick up my mini schnauzer and hold it to make me feel better. But you can see that Kiki Smith is, completely left out background, so that we're really completely focused on her face. And it's interesting. I'm curious to hear you, right in your seat right now, wherever you are. Think about what, interpret what the woman is thinking. And then, of course, we'll be reviewing this work, but here are two, reclining female nudes, one from the tradition of art that you'd sort of expect, and the other is a very alternate. Okay, and when you look at them together, it's always an interesting thing with art is, what do you put it next to that might highlight the differences. Okay, so we'll come back to that idea. I would like to show a couple of other works by Kiki Smith to give you a sort of an overall feel for the artist. Okay, and this one is also from this Wolf series. In fact, all of these are from the Wolf series, where Kiki Smith focused in on the subject of wolves. So because of the title Pietà, I'm hoping that you are thinking back to something you've seen in your art history set, and that would be this very wonderful and powerful work from Germany in the medieval period. And it seems that she's really taken up the theme of that. And this is from the Pace Gallery, where Kiki Smith had her show, and you could see the little Red Riding Hood, the wolf, alternating. And then finally, Kiki Smith is not only does drawing and printmaking, but this is a full bronze sculpture of the woman kind of being born out of the wolf. Very, very interesting, powerful piece. So these are some of the sources from Kiki Smith's project about wolves. And you could see it's very rich. And so I think that, a lot of contemporary art have these kind of connections with poetry, literature, art in general, even dance sometime that I think is very, very interesting. Okay. So in the end, these are some of the questions I'd like to leave you with, that there's some open-ended quality to this work. And the artist has highlighted or made this powerful by zeroing in with no background at all. Okay. And that open-ended quality also, or the ironic quality, also can have a kind of a provocative or a disturbing view to it. So if you find you see some contemporary art that has that, that's definitely a big part of it. Now, because this work is from the Renaissance, it's fair game for the AP test. So we're just going to take a spin through this work. I know you all did it earlier in the year, and so we'll think about some of these things as a review today of the visual analysis of the Titian of Venus of Urbino. Okay, so in composition of the canvas, you'll notice that there's a foreground, middle ground, and background. And of course, having that window in the back really helps to pull your view back through that space and understand that it's quite a palatial home that they're in. Also, if you notice on the floor, the tile pattern, the orthogonal lines give you the feeling of perspective, which you also learned about in Renaissance painting. And the distribution of lights and darks, the distribution of the red color, all very wonderfully composed. Also, you notice that the painting's basically split in half by this curtain that was one of those curtains that went around the bed. If you think back to the Arnolfini wedding, even in that little apartment, they have that that bed that encloses itself. It's like a room within a room. Okay, and then content-wise, this picture has iconography and details, and we'll go to those in a minute. But before that, we can see that the woman is very idealized by Titian's wonderful use of oil paint and glazing, and really I want to just admire his skill of rendering, very soft flesh, and his use of chiaroscuro, which is the subtle modeling of light and dark to really highlight her beauty. And then when we talk about iconographic details, well, one of my favorites, of course, is the dog. And it's also an interesting comparison back to the Kiki Smith drawing. But the dog, of course, would be symbolic of, loyalty, just like when we think of our dogs, and like in the Arnolfini wedding. And the other things that are significant would be like the roses, which are associated with Venus, Aphrodite, love, and then the myrtle plant up on the ledge of the window is something that would be found in weddings, associated with weddings. And then finally, the casone is the chest that the servants are sort of attending to in the background. Here's a picture of a casone. And casones would be decorated by artists during the Renaissance, and they were like a wedding chest and maybe associated with dowries and whatnot. So the context of the painting, you can always do visual analysis on a painting, but when you get to the context is really when you have to dig into your studies and sometimes dig down deep. And so here are some of the details of this work, and it's an interesting story. Guido Baldo went to visit Titian for another commission, a portrait commission, and he saw the painting there and ended up buying it. So we don't really know a lot about why Titian did this. And the original name wasn't even called Venus. It was the nude woman. But as we know, Venus was sort of a kind of, the title Venus was sort of a kind of clothing for nude women in art, a sort of way to have them be acceptable. Titian, I hope you've seen a lot of other works. You can see on the left, he's done mythologies, and he's done altar pieces, such as you see on the right. And he had a long career, lived to be very old, and executed lots of works. And I think these two works show us that in Venice, where Titian was from, that color really had this primacy. And there's even stories about, grinding up the colors of glass to add to oil paint to make it especially luminous. So that's what it is. And then in terms of the function of this art, this is not really a multiple choice question, although it looks like it. But hopefully you can see that, or figure out it wouldn't really be a commemoration of a specific person, because if you wanted to commemorate a person, you'd paint them in their Sunday best. But what it ends up, I think the best choice is the commemoration of marriage, because the iconography really alludes to the theme of marriage. Okay, so it's interesting to dig down into these works and imagine. We see this work so differently, and it's most likely that Renaissance viewers didn't really see this work because it was a very private piece. I'm sure even in the home of the Duke of Urbino, it probably hung in a private room. And of course, I think the commemoration of marriage is interesting thought, because if this is an ideal of marriage, it basically would mean that love is an ideal of marriage, and in a time where marriages were made for political reasons, that might be pretty important. Before we say goodbye to this, I wanted to review, and hopefully you talked about in your class, the male gaze theory. Laura Mulvey was a very important film critic, and she came up with this idea, if I can really try and simplify it, that in films and movies, the eye of the camera is from the perspective of a heterosexual male, and the observed female is therefore objectified. So you could see this is changed a bit today, because there's so many more female directors in film, and filmmaking and cinema has become so much more diverse. But what's really interesting about this theory is when she wrote her essay, art historians jumped on the bandwagon and said, yes, we can take this male gaze idea and apply it to art history and come up with some very interesting ideas. So the male gaze theory you can find on the internet, and you can also study culture and advertising and lots of things through the lens of this theory. Our next artist is Wangechi Mutu. And once again, staying with the theme of the reclining female nude. And I'm going to give you a minute to take this in and notice some of the details. Here's a nice picture of Wangechi Mutu. She originally is from Kenya and studied at Yale. And she is a collage artist, as well as a mixed media artist with a lot of collage. You've all made a collage somewhere in your school career, so you can just remember that when viewing Wangechi Mutu. And here is a case where the title of the work is very important. Works do not always have important titles, but sometimes they do. And it's always important to see what is going on. And if you think of praying mantra, it seems to be a little mixed up. And you think, well, if you were praying with a mantra, it would be praying with an A. But then is it supposed to be praying mantis? Okay, now praying mantis, from my understanding, it's an insect that clamps down on its mate with its legs and bites its head off. So that adds a interesting twist on this work, making it, perhaps there's danger here. Okay, so mixed media on Mylar. Wangechi Mutu would use all kinds of different magazines and things like that, and so I definitely recommend you look at some of her other work. There is a green snake. It's very hard to see, that's why I'm mentioning it, but if you look over on the right side, the color green kind of stands out. And of course, having a woman and a snake, there you go, have a little better a picture on the detail, might make you think of the Adam and Eve references that we have, a nice one in our image set as well. Now, I know that Allison talked about hybridity the other day, and this is a nice example. Wangechi Mutu, very aware of colonized, and also an artist who would be very aware of things like the male gaze theory. What does she do to elicit this response from the audience? And I think this response is probably very ambiguous. We're curious about this reclining nude, but there seems to be a danger in the air as well. The sort of blanket is a reference to kind of African blanket or African pattern made by the Kuba people in the place in Kenya where Wangechi Mutu came from. So I just wanted to remind you about this because it's another nice example of the snake, and even her hair has that snaky look. So I think this would be a rich comparison. Okay. So I'd like you to think for a moment here about some of the things the artists have in common. They're giving, almost answering to this tradition of nudes by having these alt nudes that are approaching it from a very different viewpoint, and also using animals or the wild. This is just very rich and interesting that we can do. So I think I'd like to come to the end here by reviewing another reclining female nude from your set. And because, and I put it next to the Wangechi Mutu because the Wangechi Mutu is very aware of this sort of exotic quality. And here we have a work that you studied in your image set that's definitely meant to be exotic, the Grande Odalisque by Angra. It's always hard to pronounce that name, by the way. Don't feel bad. I always seem to butcher the name of the artist. Some kids in the museum looking at it in Paris. So Angra trained with David, Jacques-Louis David. And if you'll notice, the works are executed very similarly. And this would be the academic style or the neoclassical style. But the content is very, very different. And in this neoclassical style, this academic style, drawing is very emphasized, and structure, observation. And so here's a drawing that you can see, kind of very different style from the Kiki Smith drawing. And in addition to that, the artist was influenced by past art, such as mannerism, because you can see that the woman has some distortion in anatomy, such as a lengthening of the spine that really stood out to people. So I put the mannerist works up to remind you. And it's always interesting to see what's influenced an artist. We always want to know that as art historians. Now, another reason I always want to show more than one picture, you know, I want you to think of every work in your set as a door that you go through. Once you go through that door, you have to find out what that artist is about, because in this case, these kinds of portraits would be the bread and butter of the artists who made their living by you know, doing work like this. And a lot of times the work that's chosen for the set, well, it either could be typical or it could be an outlier of the kind of work that the artist was known for. And in this case, the work that we're considering was commissioned by Napoleon's sister. And it reflected a new trend, a new fashion, a new taste for the exotic. And just before this time, Napoleon had made his expedition into Egypt. And when we say Orientalism, and I know that Allison talked a little bit about Orientalism the other day, it you know, it really refers to the Mideast, and the countries were really lumped together. So to Europeans, whether it be Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, they really lump them together into a kind of a stereotyped exotic world. And I'd like you to read the text here. It's a little bit about explaining what Orientalism is. And once again, we're dealing with stereotypes here. And the academic who came out with this, Edward Said, is very wonderful and has a very great YouTube explaining Orientalism in about 10 minutes. I recommend that you watch that. So you can see some details in this work of this culture. Okay, so this is my attempt to describe Orientalism in a very short way. Okay, because we can see that she has a peacock fan, a turban, a sort of jewel encrusted mirror, something like that, and then a pipe, a hookah smoking pipe. And these were all the accoutrements of a harem, something like that. And of course, the interesting part is that Aang never went to a harem. It's all from his imagination, and this would be based on European fantasies of what went on in a harem as opposed to the reality. So we would like to take some of these modern or post-colonial ideas, and by the way, Edward Said was one of the first, or the first, to come up with this post-colonial studies, and see if they can give us a new perspectives of this work from today, and how this work will look different from today than it did at its time. Okay. Now, these works will not be on your AP test, but if they were, this was be what I would like to ask you about. And I think students would have a lot of fun doing this question. And I think that these works hopefully have engaged your imagination, and they remain open. I can't really tell you, oh, this is what this work means, and that's that. They're very, like a good poem or a good work of literature, they're very open. Okay. So our takeaways of today are an introduction to two wonderful artists from the global contemporary set, who also related to this tradition of the reclining female nude, which you've studied in your class. And we went back and we reviewed two of those works that will be on the AP test. And then we've seen some sort of contemporary tools like the male gaze theory and Orientalism are ways of looking back at those from a contemporary standpoint. And so you might think of, well, he left out a really important reclining female nude. And I'd like you to think about what that is before I tell you that it is Manet's Olympia. And that one we'll come back to another time. So as part of your homework, I'd like you to simply identify these works and then talk about what they have in common and how they're different, remembering that there's about 300 years between these two works, okay? And Alison Napier will touch base on this question when she sees you tomorrow. So I'm very excited about this week. We're going to see some really interesting global contemporary works and compare them to other works in the set. Okay, until next time, John Gunnan signing off.